10 months ago, my parents stood outside the gates of a $40 million Malibu estate, holding the torn pieces of the security guard, standing between them and the cameras, checked. He looked at my mother, then my father, and asked if they had an invitation. I didn't walk out to meet them. I didn't need to. I had already made my choice 5 months before that, in a quiet private room at a restaurant, when my mother decided to show me exactly what she thought of my boundaries. The air in the private dining room smelled heavily of my mother's signature floral perfume, masking the faint scent of roasted garlic from the kitchen. It was February of 2025. My sister, Hallie, sat nervously between us, tracing the condensation on her water glass. Connor, my fiancé, was seated at a small table near the door, keeping his distance just as we had agreed. I was 38, a civil rights attorney specializing in cases involving private youth facilities, and I was about to ask my parents to attend my wedding. I pushed the 2 heavy, cream-colored envelopes across the table. They were conditional invitations. They clearly outlined my media boundaries, specifically regarding a documentary I was consulting on. The film investigated the troubled teen industry, including Hawthorne Ridge Youth Center, the facility they had sent me to when I was 16. I didn't plan to tell my own story, but I needed to ensure they wouldn't use my wedding as an opportunity to control the narrative. My father, Martin, didn't touch the envelopes. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it toward me. It was a non-disclosure agreement. He called it a document to protect the family. I read it quickly. It forbade me from participating in any project that mentioned Hawthorne Ridge and demanded I waive any unknown claims. He wanted me to sign away my voice before he would even consider coming to my wedding. I pushed the paper back. I told him my attorney wouldn't allow me to sign it. My mother, Gloria, laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the low hum of the restaurant. She picked up the invitations. Her manicured nails dug into the thick paper. Then, she ripped them in half. She laughed again, a little louder this time, and said they were saving their money for Hallie's real wedding anyway. Hallie flinched, but didn't say a word. She just watched the pieces of my invitations flutter onto the table. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the shredded paper resting next to my father's pristine non-disclosure agreement. I stood up, looked my mother in the eye, and said, "Got it." I walked toward the door. Connor stood up, his eyes on the torn paper. He asked if I wanted to go back for the pieces. I told him no. The image was enough. The next morning, the air in my office felt stale, despite the hum of the air conditioning. My assistant handed me a padded envelope. It had no return address. Inside, there was a faded, stiff plastic hospital bracelet. I ran my thumb over the cold surface. The name printed on it was mine. The admission date matched the day they sent me away. The facility code read Hawthorne Ridge. There was a printed note underneath the bracelet. It read, "Your mother came every month, she knew." I checked the reception security footage. It showed a courier dropping off the package, but nothing about who sent it. I didn't call my parents. I called Elena Ruiz, my independent counsel. Elena ran the code on the bracelet against old licensing records. I listened to the steady tapping of her keyboard, the sound loud in the quiet of her office. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely steady. She said the code didn't belong to the treatment wing. It belonged to the administrative office, the place where parents signed extension forms. Elena dropped the faded plastic hospital bracelet into a clear evidence bag. The heavy zip closure made a sharp, definitive snapping sound that echoed in the quiet space of her corner office. My lawyer picked up a thick black marker and wrote the date, the time, and her initials across the white label. I stood by the window, watching the morning traffic crawl along the freeway below, but my attention remained completely fixed on that small plastic band. I wanted to take it back. More than that, I wanted to log into the state judicial databases using my professional credentials. I knew exactly which search portals to use to pull every defunct file attached to Hawthorne Ridge Youth Center. Elena set the marker down, leveled a calm look at me, and told me exactly why I could not touch my laptop. She explained the rules of evidence collection with the clinical precision of someone who had built a career on technicalities. If we broke the chain of custody, or if I used my specialized access improperly to hunt down my own family, my parents would easily dismiss everything as a vindictive, unethical stunt. The opposing counsel would tear the findings apart before they ever reached a civil hearing. The attorney was absolutely right, and her logic only made the waiting feel like a physical weight on my chest. Hawthorne Ridge had declared bankruptcy in 2017. The facility itself was gone, replaced by a commercial real estate development, which meant the original records were scattered. We spent 2 full days tracking the paper trail, dealing with endless automated phone systems and indifferent clerks. The state licensing board only kept broad operational reports, nothing with patient specifics. The financial records had supposedly been transferred to a liquidation firm, and the daily administrative logs were lost in the chaotic handover of assets. I found myself staring at my office wall late on Wednesday evening, listening to the low hum of the air conditioning. I wondered if my mother had known the place was failing when she sent me there, or if she had simply found the most convenient disposal site for a daughter who asked too many questions. The phone on my desk rang late on Thursday afternoon. The caller ID glowed with an unknown number. I answered, expecting another runaround from a low-level state clerk or a paralegal. Instead, a woman spoke. Her voice sounded thin, carrying a slight, nervous tremble that forced me to press the receiver closer to my ear. She identified herself as Ellen Price. The former administrative clerk confirmed she was the person who had sent the anonymous package to my office earlier that week. Ellen explained she had seen the press release announcing my involvement in the upcoming documentary. She recognized my name immediately. She kept her voice low, rushing her words together, terrified that Martin or Leonard Pike, the former facility director, would find out she was talking to a lawyer. I told her we needed a lot more than an anonymous package in the mail. Elena took over the conversation, speaking clearly and slowly into the speakerphone. My lawyer explained the harsh legal reality to the frightened woman on the other end of the line. We needed a sworn statement, a verifiable source for any documents, and a documented chain of custody. A random drop in the mail would not hold up in any court, let alone on a national broadcast. Ellen went completely silent. 10 seconds passed. The only sound in the office was the faint, rhythmic static on the telephone line. Then, the former clerk took a shaky breath and said she had kept something else. She admitted she had hidden a file for 22 years, but she demanded to meet in a secure location before handing it over. The smell of industrial bleach hit my nose the moment I stepped out of my office suite that evening. It was just the overnight cleaning crew mopping the hallway, but my lungs tightened instantly. That sharp, chemical odor pulled me straight back to a sterile corridor in the late fall of 2003. I was 16 years old again. My cheap canvas sneakers squeaked against cold linoleum floors. Fluorescent tube lights buzzed above my head like a swarm of angry insects, casting a sickly yellow glow over the painted cinder block walls. A senior staff member stood in front of a heavy wooden door, blocking my path to the visiting area. The woman looked down at me, her face completely blank, and delivered the news in a flat, practiced tone. She stated that my mother had not come for the monthly visitation day. The staff member claimed I was simply not stable enough for family contact, citing my recent protests as proof of defiance. I remembered the heavy, suffocating weight settling in my chest right then, the absolute, crushing certainty that my family had intentionally forgotten me. Ellen Price sat rigidly in one of the leather chairs in Elena's conference room the following morning. The older woman kept her beige raincoat buttoned all the way up, her hands clutching a worn canvas tote bag in her lap. She did not look like a heroic whistleblower. She looked like someone who had spent 2 decades carrying a secret she could no longer endure. Ellen explained that the strict confidentiality agreement she had signed upon termination was not the real reason she had stayed quiet all these years. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, placing it carefully on the glass table. The heavy paper slapped against the surface, the sound loud in the tense room. Ellen confessed that the actual reason she remained silent was profound shame. She had been a willing part of the system that kept kids locked away. I reached across the table and opened the folder. Inside sat a thick stack of photocopied pages. It was the Master Administrative Visitor Log from the winter of 2003 through the end of 2004. Ellen explained she had made the copies late one night before the bankruptcy because she suspected the director was actively altering medical files to justify fraudulent insurance billing. My eyes scanned the neatly ruled columns. The copied paper felt rough under my fingertips. I found the page for November. I flipped to December. Then January. The name Gloria Whitmore appeared on every single page. My mother had driven to the Hawthorne Ridge facility on the first Tuesday of every month. I traced a line across the paper to the columns specifically labeled for resident visitation. The boxes were completely blank. She had never once requested to see me. I moved my finger to the next column over, the one designated for administrative conferences. A sharp, familiar, cursive signature filled every one of those boxes. She had sat in the front office, signed the paperwork to keep me locked inside, and then driven back home. Ellen leaned forward, her chair creaking loudly under the sudden movement. She looked directly at me, her eyes watering. She told me she used to sit at the front reception desk while my mother met with the facility directors. The former clerk admitted she had taken the handwritten letters I had given the staff, the desperate notes begging to go home, and handed them directly to my mother. Gloria had read them right there at the desk. The drive back to my house that evening felt like moving through deep water. I walked through the front door just after 8 o'clock. Connor was standing at the kitchen island, drafting architectural plans under the warm pendant lights. He looked up, his expression guarded and unreadable. I dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, the clatter echoing too loudly in the quiet house. I told him everything was handled, and that Elena had secured a massive piece of documentary evidence. Connor set his drafting pencil down. He walked around the counter and stood in front of me, close enough that I could smell the familiar scent of cedar shavings and rain on his shirt. He did not raise his voice. He asked me why I was treating our upcoming marriage like a hostile negotiation I needed to manage entirely on my own. He pointed out that I had spent the last 3 days dodging his calls, deflecting his questions, and giving him sanitized status updates instead of having a real conversation. The truth lodged in my throat like a stone. I realized I was doing exactly what I always did when I felt cornered. I was locking everything down, controlling the flow of information, and treating the man I loved like a dangerous variable that needed containment. My desperate need to build an impenetrable case against my parents was bleeding into the safest place I had left. I let out a long breath, my tense shoulders finally dropping. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the photocopy of the visitor log, handing the pages to him. Connor took the paper, his eyes scanning the blank visitation columns and the repeating signatures. He did not offer empty comfort. He did not try to solve the legal problem for me or offer useless platitudes. He just nodded, handing the paper back, and told me he was entirely on my side, provided I actually allowed him to stand next to me. I took the document back to my home office. The small desk lamp cast a yellow circle on the scattered papers. I flipped past the winter months, turning to the final page of the log, the one detailing my eventual discharge month. Down at the very bottom corner, below the standard billing signatures and staff initials, a small handwritten note caught my attention. The ink was faded in the photocopy, but the words were perfectly legible. It read that the parent approved a continued communication restriction. Right next to that sentence, validating my complete isolation, was the unmistakable signature of Gloria Whitmore. The screen of my cell phone lit up just before noon on Friday. A restricted number flashed across the glass. I let it ring twice before picking up, expecting a court clerk returning a scheduling request. Instead, the deep, resonant voice of my father filled the earpiece. Martin Whitmore did not bother with a greeting. He bypassed small talk entirely and informed me that my recent digging was causing Hallie unnecessary distress. His tone carried that familiar, practiced cadence he always used for board meetings and reprimands, a voice designed to make the listener feel small and unreasonable. I pulled a legal pad toward me and uncapped my pen. I told him any further communication needed to go directly through Elena Ruiz. A low chuckle sounded through the speaker. My father stated that hiring a lawyer would not magically erase my history, nor would it change the fact that I had been a danger to my own family. He wanted a reaction. The man who had spent his life controlling the narrative needed me to scream, to argue, to prove his point that I was still the unstable teenager he had locked away. I wrote down the exact time, noted his exact phrasing, and then I simply ended the call. The click of the disconnecting line felt infinitely heavier than any argument. That afternoon, Elena arranged a secure conference call with Ellen Price and an independent forensic accountant. We sat in the law firm boardroom, the speakerphone resting in the center of a massive oak table. Ellen's voice filtered through the speaker, steadier now than it had been the day before. The former clerk detailed exactly how Hawthorne Ridge generated its profits. The facility charged parents by the month, utilizing mandatory progress reviews to justify extending a child's confinement. Ellen explained that resistance behavior, including crying, asking to call home, or questioning the rules, automatically resulted in a failed review. Each failure guaranteed another 30 days of billing. Elena leaned forward, asking how my father's consulting firm fit into the structure. Martin did not receive envelopes of illicit cash for my admission. The reality was much cleaner and entirely corporate. Ellen stated that Whitmore Development Strategies held a lucrative market expansion contract with the youth center. The facility paid my father performance bonuses based directly on revenue growth and new family admissions. The forensic accountant, a quiet man named David, pushed a thick bound folder across the table toward me. He had spent the morning cross-referencing Hawthorne Ridge bankruptcy filings with old corporate tax records. David pointed to a highlighted column on the second page. The dates aligned perfectly. The largest bonus payment cleared exactly 3 weeks after my parents drove me to the facility. My father had leveraged my admission, packaging my forced absence as a successful intervention story to sell the program to other wealthy, desperate families. Every single time my mother signed a 30-day extension and approved my communication restriction, she simultaneously protected her husband's corporate cash flow. I stared at the embossed logo on the copied invoice. The sharp, interlocking, geometric shapes of the Whitmore Development Strategies letterhead blurred for a second. The smell of expensive leather and stale coffee suddenly filled my memory. I was 16 years old again, standing in my father's home office on a crisp autumn evening in 2003. I had opened his leather briefcase, searching for a calculator for my math homework. Instead, I found a billing invoice. The document listed Hawthorne Ridge Youth Center as the client. I remembered asking him why a place meant to help troubled kids was paying his company thousands of dollars. Martin had snatched the paper out of my hand. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He called me a thief, an invader of his private workspace, and a disturbed child who created problems where none existed. That confrontation ignited the massive argument later that night. The very argument that ended with a shattered vase and a fabricated story about me attacking my younger sister. He had to silence me because I had accidentally uncovered his revenue stream. David's voice pulled me back to the quiet boardroom. The accountant tapped a separate document at the back of the folder. It was a salvaged insurance intake form from my original admission file. I read the text under the referring party section. The intake coordinator had clearly typed that I was a direct family referral connected to development consultant M. Whitmore. I was never just a patient to them. I was a business asset, a physical extension of a corporate contract. Elena asked if there were any other direct financial links between the facility and the Whitmore family accounts. David nodded, turning to the final page of his financial summary. He adjusted his glasses and traced a pen down a list of secondary disbursements. The facility had issued several smaller, recurring payments labeled as educational grants. The accountant pointed out that the recipient of those specific funds was not Martin. The money had bypassed his corporate accounts entirely. The secondary payments had been deposited directly into a private tuition trust fund, and the beneficiary listed on that account was Hallie Whitmore. My sister sat across from me in Elena's conference room 2 days later, staring at the forensic accounting summary. Hallie had come without telling our parents. Her hands rested flat on the polished mahogany table, and her knuckles were completely white. I slid the copied financial disbursement page directly into her line of sight, tapping the line that clearly showed the tuition trust fund in her name. I demanded to know exactly how much she understood about her college money. The question came out sharper than I intended, carrying 22 years of accumulated resentment. Hallie leaned back, putting distance between herself and the document. She stated firmly that she was only 11 years old when the facility took me away. My younger sister insisted she only knew our parents had set up a standard education account, the kind any suburban family might have. My jaw tightened. I leaned forward and told her she had lived her entire adult life balancing on the price I had paid, and she had never once bothered to look down. Hallie's head snapped up. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice rose to match mine. She told me I was treating her exactly like a hostile witness on a cross-examination stand instead of a sister. Elena intervened immediately. The attorney raised a hand, her silver bracelets clinking against the glass table. She instructed us to stop treating the room like a courtroom. Elena pointed out that we needed to separate what an 11-year-old child could realistically comprehend from what a 33-year-old woman had conveniently chosen not to ask. That quiet distinction shifted the energy in the room. Hallie took a slow, deep breath and finally looked directly at me. She admitted her memories of that autumn night in 2003 were fragmented. She remembered Martin screaming in his office, and she recalled a heavy decorative object flying across the room. My sister clearly remembered my hands grabbing her shoulders, pulling her down toward the carpet. After that, everything blurred into our mother repeating the same sentence over and over, telling everyone I had viciously attacked her. Hallie confessed she never actually remembered the exact moment she got hurt. Only the narrative our parents built around her bruised ribs. She reached down to the floor, lifted a large canvas tote bag, and unzipped the top. Hallie explained she had gone to our parents' house the previous afternoon because Gloria insisted she retrieve an antique family veil for her real wedding. While digging through a heavy wooden cedar chest in the guest bedroom, Hallie had found something else hidden beneath the old lace. My sister pulled a weathered cardboard box from her bag and set it on the table. My name was written across the lid, in black marker. Inside sat a thick stack of unstamped envelopes and a small stack of yellow sticky notes covered in my mother's handwriting. I reached for the top envelope, recognizing my own hurried teenage handwriting. I pulled the single sheet of lined notebook paper free. The date at the top matched the exact same Tuesday in November, when the administrative log placed my mother inside the Hawthorne Ridge facility. The letter was short. I had begged my mother to just come inside the residential wing and ask the staff what they were doing to us. A yellow sticky note was attached to the back of the envelope. Gloria had written a clear directive to the facility staff, instructing them not to mail any of my correspondence because it contained manipulative fabrications. She had been standing in the same building, signing the restriction forms, and actively intercepting my calls for help. The betrayal felt cold and absolute, but Hallie was not finished. She reached back into her tote bag and pulled out a faded manila folder. It was my original medical intake file from the youth center. Clipped to the inside cover was a carbon copy of a commercial warehouse transfer slip. Hallie pushed the slip toward Elena. My sister explained she suddenly remembered our father ordering his company staff to digitize several old family videotapes just days before I was sent away. He had submitted a specific cut of footage to the facility intake board, but he never kept the original source media at the house. Elena picked up the transfer slip, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The document bore the logo of Whitmore Development Strategies. The text clearly stated that the original source footage had been returned to the corporate media archive and placed in Box 14. The attorney did not waste a single second. She picked up her desk phone and began drafting a formal legal preservation notice. Elena explained that the storage vendor would never hand over the box just because Hallie recognized the inventory code. We needed a binding hold to prevent Martin from destroying the evidence the moment he realized we were looking for it. We sat in the office for 3 hours while Elena worked the phones, navigating the corporate bureaucracy of the third-party storage company. The vendor finally confirmed they had located the specific corporate archive. Box 14 still existed deep in their facility, having been misfiled years ago under a sweeping commercial hold during a corporate restructuring. The vendor agreed to keep the container sealed until a neutral forensic laboratory could take secure custody. My cell phone buzzed against the wooden table just as Elena hung up her receiver. An email notification lit up the screen. The storage vendor had forwarded a digital photograph of the original inventory index card attached to the sealed container. I opened the image, zooming in on the typewritten text at the very bottom of the card. The final line detailed the exact contents waiting inside Box 14. It read, "Whitmore Family Incident Raw Mini DV Source. The image of the inventory card burned itself into my vision. That single typewritten line promised exactly what I had been chasing for 22 years, and the urge to drive straight to the industrial park nearly overpowered my common sense. I told Elena we needed to secure the container that very afternoon. My lawyer shook her head, calmly explaining that the vendor would never release commercial property to an unauthorized individual just because my sister recognized a tracking code. Elena drafted a sworn affidavit for Hallie to sign regarding the discovery of the transfer slip, then filed an emergency preservation order. The legal machinery moved painfully slow, and by the time I returned home, my patience had completely evaporated. Connor found me pacing the length of our living room. He watched my erratic movements for several minutes before stepping into my path, effectively halting my momentum. My fiancé did not raise his voice, but his tone carried a weight that demanded attention. He pointed out that my fear of the evidence disappearing was entirely justified. Yet if I broke the chain of custody now, I would hand my father the perfect excuse to claim the footage was tampered with. The architect stood his ground, reminding me that speed meant nothing if a judge threw the tape out of court. The cold logic of his argument finally pierced my panic. I forced my tense shoulders to drop, agreeing to let the neutral forensic laboratory handle the extraction. We waited 3 agonizing days for the legal clearances to process. The independent media laboratory sat inside a windowless concrete building, humming with the sound of massive server towers and cooling fans. An audio-visual forensic expert broke the old corporate seal on Box 14, while Elena documented the entire process. The container held a single, dust-covered mini-DV cassette. The technician carefully loaded the small plastic rectangle into a specialized playback deck, routing the signal to a large monitor on the wall. Hallie sat rigidly in a metal folding chair next to me. Her hands gripped the plastic edges of the seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. The screen flickered, displaying the continuous, unbroken timecode of raw footage, and suddenly, we were standing in my childhood living room. The digital recording quality was grainy, but the events played out with terrifying clarity. Martin towered over the coffee table, his face distorted by rage. He grabbed a heavy bronze bookend, hurling it across the room directly at my younger sister. My 16-year-old self lunged forward, grabbing Hallie by the shoulders and pulling her violently toward the carpet. As I shielded her head with my arms, Hallie's side slammed hard against the sharp wooden edge of the table. We crumpled to the floor together, tangled and gasping for air. The visual evidence was damning enough, but the real nightmare began when the room fell silent on screen. I expected to hear my father apologize or call for a doctor. Instead, Martin stepped over the shattered glass, looked directly at my mother, and delivered a clear, calculated instruction. "Call the program," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Tell them she attacked her sister." Gloria did not scream or run to check on her injured child. The woman who had raised us simply nodded, crossing her arms over her chest. She asked Martin exactly what time they should claim the assault occurred to align with the facility admission schedule. The version of the tape my parents had submitted to the intake board completely excised the thrown bookend, starting the clip at the exact moment my hands shoved Hallie downward. They had weaponized my attempt to save her life. The laboratory monitor faded to black. Hallie stared at the dark glass, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her makeup. She stood up slowly, reaching into her purse for her cell phone. My sister did not look at me when she spoke, but her voice carried a new, unfamiliar resolve. She stated she was officially canceling the venue deposits that our parents had offered to pay, and she formally granted Elena permission to use her likeness in the video for the legal filings. However, she stopped short of full public participation. Hallie looked down at the floor, admitting she was not ready to sit under the bright lights of a documentary interview and let a national audience watch her world collapse. A younger version of myself would have demanded her total compliance, viewing her hesitation as cowardice. Instead, I simply nodded, telling her that preserving the truth was enough. I refused to steal her agency the way our parents had stolen mine. We walked out of the laboratory into the bright afternoon sun, the heavy weight of the last 2 decades finally shifting off my chest. An urgent message from Maya Chen, the documentary producer, flashed across the screen. The text contained a forwarded email attachment directly from my mother. Gloria and Martin had just sent the network legal department a thick dossier of fabricated medical summaries, claiming I was experiencing a severe psychological breakdown and aggressively coercing my sister into a malicious revenge campaign. The heavy leather binder landed on Elena's conference table with a dull thud. Maya Chen, the documentary producer, slid the compiled dossier across the polished glass. The thick stack of paper smelled strongly of fresh printer toner, carrying my parents' latest attempt to destroy my credibility. Maya pointed to the top document, explaining that Martin and Gloria had overnighted a comprehensive psychological profile to the network legal department. My eyes scanned the first page, and a familiar, messy teenage handwriting filled the margins. They had submitted the letters I wrote from Hawthorne Ridge, the exact same ones Hallie found in the cedar chest. However, my parents had meticulously sliced the paragraphs apart. They presented only the angry, desperate sentences to paint a picture of a violent, unhinged teenager. The edited versions conveniently erased every single paragraph where I begged for an independent psychological evaluation or requested a lawyer. My hands curled into tight fists under the table. Anger flared hot in my chest, and I demanded that we release the unedited letters immediately to expose the manipulation. Elena reached over and placed her hand flat over the binder. The attorney looked at me with clinical calm, reminding me that my teenage letters referenced the names and medical struggles of several other minors. Releasing the full documents would violate their privacy, turning innocent people into collateral damage for my revenge. Her quiet logic felt like a bucket of ice water, and I forced myself to take a slow breath. Protecting other survivors was not a defeat, so I nodded and stepped back from the ledge. We needed to prove the facility operated as a corrupt system, not just a stage for a family dispute. Ellen Price provided the missing structural link the following morning. The former administrative clerk brought a faded staff orientation manual to the law office. She traced her finger down a page outlining resident compliance metrics. The protocol explicitly classified crying, requesting parental contact, or questioning the rules as resistance behavior. Every documented instance of resistance automatically triggered a 30-day extension of a child's confinement. My father had profited from an entirely rigged game. 3 other former residents agreed to meet with us in a private consultation room later that week. Each woman confirmed the exact same operational pattern. The facility staff had routinely intercepted their mail, based monthly progress reports entirely on parental accusations, and extended their stays whenever they dared to complain. Listening to their stories, the ethical lines of my profession snapped sharply into focus. I sat across from the 3 women and formally recused myself from acting as their attorney. Serving as both a victim and a legal representative would create a massive conflict of interest, potentially jeopardizing their claims. I handed them the contact information for an independent civil rights organization, ensuring their cases remained legally pristine. Elena then laid out the brutal reality of our timeline. She explained that the legal system did not operate on pure moral outrage, and not every injury from 2003 could be prosecuted today. The lawyer crossed out several potential claims on her legal pad. We would only move forward with actions supported by a newly opened state look-back window for youth facility victims. We could also pursue the financial fraud under the delayed discovery doctrine, since my father had actively concealed his corporate contracts. Finally, we would add immediate defamation charges based on the dossier they had just mailed to the network. Every outdated theory was discarded. The sheer weight of the verified evidence finally convinced the network executives to move forward. The producers wanted to host a live fundraising event for youth facility survivors, and a wealthy philanthropist offered his sprawling, $40 million Malibu estate as the venue. Maya suggested concluding the broadcast with Connor and me exchanging our wedding vows, framing the ceremony as a definitive symbol of reclaimed agency. I looked at Connor, seeing the quiet support in his posture, and I agreed on 2 strict conditions. The ceremony could not involve any direct confrontation with my family, and every single survivor involved had to retain total control over their own interview footage. The network did not actually need my sister to prove the systemic corruption, but her testimony remained the only weapon capable of destroying the central lie my parents had built their social empire upon. The final pieces were locking perfectly into place. Then, Maya's cell phone buzzed against the glass table, vibrating with an urgent email notification. The producer picked up the device, her expression dropping as she read the subject line. Gloria had just contacted the network directly. My mother claimed Hallie had officially retracted her entire statement and would be attending the Malibu event alongside her parents to save her older sister from a tragic, paranoid obsession. The digital clock on my desk ticked past 4 in the afternoon. 4 outbound calls to my sister had gone straight to a generic automated voicemail. A heavy, familiar dread began to settle in my chest, whispering that Hallie had chosen the comfort of our parents' bank accounts over the brutal reality of that videotape. My thumb hovered over the phone keyboard. I typed out a bitter message, asking if she was really going to let them buy her silence again. My thumb paused over the send button. A younger version of me would have fired that message off immediately, needing to strike first before the betrayal fully landed. Instead, I stared at the harsh, glowing words, and then hit the backspace key until the screen was completely blank. I refused to let fear turn me into an interrogator. The heavy glass door of the law firm swung open just before 5 o'clock. Hallie walked into the conference room, looking like she had not slept in days. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes, and her usually perfect posture had completely collapsed. My younger sister did not say a word at first. She just walked straight to the table, dropped her cell phone onto the polished wood, and placed a folded sheet of hotel stationery right next to it. Elena picked up the paper, unfolding it carefully. The attorney scanned the handwritten lines, her expression tightening into a professional mask. My lawyer handed the stationery across the table to me. The cursive handwriting unmistakably belonged to Gloria Whitmore. It was a pre-written script, a complete public statement crafted entirely for my sister to read. The document instructed Hallie to claim she had no clear memory of the incident. The text specifically dictated that the video footage lacked crucial context, and it accused me of aggressively pressuring a vulnerable family member. One specific phrase caught my eye immediately. Our mother had written that I was suffering from a paranoid obsession, which was the exact same terminology she had used in my intake file back in 2003. She had kept her manipulation playbook completely unchanged for 22 years. Hallie reached forward and tapped the screen of her phone. A recorded voicemail began to play. "Just say you do not remember, sweetheart." My mother's voice echoed through the quiet conference room. The tone sounded remarkably sweet, dripping with that manufactured concern she always used in public. "No one can prove a memory. Your father and I are trying to protect your future. If you let your sister drag you into this television spectacle, we will have no choice but to withdraw the wedding funds and the house down payment. Do not throw your life away for her." The recording clicked off, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. My sister explained she had gone dark because she needed to stay at the house long enough to let them lay out their entire strategy. She had waited for them to explicitly tie their financial support to her perjury, carefully saving every single threat. My frustration flared despite my best efforts to stay calm. I asked her why she even hesitated when we already had the raw video proving exactly what happened. Hallie looked directly at me, her eyes completely dry but filled with a hollow kind of grief. She stated that telling the truth on a national broadcast meant publicly admitting she had called her own sister a monster for 2 entire decades. Acknowledging the truth required tearing down the foundation of her entire life. I closed my mouth, letting the harsh reality of her words land. Pushing her for an apology would only serve my ego, and I realized I needed to give her the space to mourn the family she thought she had. My sister took a shaky breath and confessed that she no longer had a wedding to fund anyway. She had shown the video and the voicemail to her fiancé, Grant, the night before. Grant did not leave because of the public scandal or the looming lawsuit. He packed his bags because Hallie admitted she had genuinely considered keeping the lie just to save the venue deposit. The cost of her lifelong compliance had finally caught up with her in the most devastating way possible. Elena quietly slid a stack of legal releases across the table. The documents included formal consent forms for the network to use Hallie's likeness in the broadcast, along with an agreement to provide sworn testimony for the civil filings. Hallie picked up a pen. She did not ask for my forgiveness before signing the papers, and she did not try to force a tearful reconciliation. My sister simply pressed the ink to the paper, legally binding herself to the truth. She understood that doing the right thing today did not magically erase 22 years of silence, and I respected her enough to accept that boundary. We were still sitting at the table, discussing the logistical timeline with Elena, when Maya Chen sent an urgent priority email to the legal team. The documentary producer had just received a press alert from a prominent crisis management firm hired by Martin Whitmore. My father had issued a formal public notice regarding the upcoming Malibu charity gala. The statement declared that he and Gloria were securing accommodations near the venue, and they fully intended to arrive at the estate gates on the night of the live broadcast. Their stated goal was to rescue their youngest daughter from the malicious individuals who were currently exploiting her. The battle was officially moving to the gates of my wedding. The salty ocean breeze whipped across the manicured lawns of the $40 million Malibu estate, carrying the faint, sweet scent of climbing jasmine from the massive floral arches near the cliff edge. I sat at a glass patio table with the head of private security, sliding 2 glossy 8x10 photographs across the smooth surface. The images showed my parents looking impeccably dressed at a recent charity dinner, projecting their usual aura of untouchable wealth. I tapped the glossy paper, instructing the guard captain that these specific individuals were absolutely not allowed through the main gates without a physical invitation. The captain nodded, running a thick finger over his clipboard, and assured me his team handled high-profile gatecrashers every single week. I specifically requested that his men maintain a completely neutral tone, engaging in 0 arguments. If my parents arrived, the guards were only to ask for a valid invitation and then close the heavy wrought iron gates. Maya Chen leaned against the stone balustrade a few feet away, sipping from a paper coffee cup while the catering crew hauled heavy wooden tables across the grass. The documentary producer pointed out that since Martin and Gloria had explicitly issued a public press release about their arrival, the press staging area right outside the estate was legally fair game. She asked for permission to keep a dedicated camera crew stationed near the perimeter. The network desperately wanted the confrontation, hunting for a dramatic climax to boost their broadcast ratings. I agreed to the exterior cameras on one strict condition. Nobody was allowed to give me a single update about the front gate once the ceremony began. For the first time in 22 years, I chose to surrender control over my parents' actions, accepting that I could protect my peace without actively micromanaging their incoming attack. Later that afternoon, Elena and I sat in a makeshift production trailer parked behind the catering tents to review the final legal cut of the broadcast. The small space smelled of hot electronics and ozone, completely detached from the wedding preparations happening just outside the metal door. We watched the editing timeline scroll across a glowing monitor. The attorney had meticulously scrubbed the footage, ensuring the network only aired verified corporate contracts, the administrative visitor logs, and the specific video segment my sister had formally cleared. Every single reference to the other survivors remained heavily redacted, their identities safely protected behind thick black bars and altered audio tracks. Then, a specific frame flashed onto the screen. The editor had magnified the yellow sticky note in my mother's handwriting, the one explicitly instructing the facility staff not to mail my letters. A sudden, bitter heat flared in my chest. I pointed at the monitor and told Maya to insert the full, unedited text of my teenage letters right next to Gloria's note. I wanted the millions of viewers to read every desperate word, to see exactly how cruel my mother had been when she buried my pleas for help. Connor placed his hand over mine, his calloused fingers grounding me in the claustrophobic trailer. The architect asked a quiet, devastating question. He wanted to know if I actually wanted justice, or if I just wanted my mother to feel as completely exposed and observed as I had felt when I was 16. That single inquiry forced me to look at the exact kind of person I was becoming. I stared at the screen, listening to the hum of the hard drives, and realized he was entirely right. Sinking to her level of spectacle would only poison the victory. I turned to Maya and instructed her to cut the private letters, leaving only the verified signature to speak for itself. The sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the empty rows of white wooden chairs set up for the rehearsal. Hallie walked down the grassy aisle alone, carrying a heavy canvas garment bag over her arm. My sister unzipped the casing, pulling out a cascade of antique lace that caught the fading evening light. The fabric was the heirloom veil our mother had carefully preserved for what she considered a real wedding. Hallie held the delicate material out to me, her knuckles pale as she gripped the comb. She offered it as a silent peace offering, a fragile bridge over the wreckage of our family history. I reached out, letting my fingers brush the soft netting, but I gently pushed her hands back toward her chest. I explained that I could not wear something tied to a history of lies. Yet I made sure my voice carried no judgment. We stood together in the cool evening air, and we agreed she would sit in the very first row tomorrow. She would be there as a witness and as my sister, but she would not speak or participate in the live broadcasted interviews. The ocean crashed rhythmically against the cliffs below my hotel suite later that night, rattling the glass balcony doors. An exhausted production assistant knocked on my door just past 10 o'clock, handing me a small, velvet-lined evidence box. The forensic laboratory had finally returned my property after completely digitizing the contents. I opened the lid and stared at the faded plastic hospital bracelet resting on the dark fabric. I did not slip it onto my wrist, nor did I cry over the faded ink. I simply closed the box and tucked it deep inside my leather briefcase, treating it like archived history rather than an open wound. My cell phone lit up on the nightstand early the next morning, while a makeup artist pinned my hair into place. The bright screen illuminated a new text message from Elena. The legal team had just confirmed that Martin and Gloria Whitmore had checked into a luxury resort just 3 miles down the Pacific Coast Highway. The battle lines were officially drawn. Maya walked into my dressing room an hour later, holding her production tablet tight against her chest. The producer took a sharp breath, announcing that my parents were currently logged into the network's streaming platform from their hotel room. The broadcast had started, and the raw footage of my father throwing the bronze bookend was scheduled to air in exactly 10 minutes. The glow of the dressing room monitor cast a pale, flickering light across the heavy silk of my wedding dress. I sat perfectly still in the quiet suite, listening to the documentary broadcast echoing through the network streaming platform. The screen displayed the faded visitor log right next to the desperate letter I had written on that exact same Tuesday in November of 2003. My recorded voiceover played through the speakers, sticking strictly to the verified dates and the administrative signatures. I did not call my mother a monster, and I did not label my father a narcissist. I simply laid out the cold, undeniable architecture of a rigged system. Then, the raw mini-DV footage rolled. The bronze bookend flew across the screen, a heavy blur of violent intent. My teenage arms pulled Hallie down to the floor, shielding her head just as she hit the table. Right beside that undeniable truth, the network played the edited clip our parents had submitted to the facility. The contrast was devastating. Hallie's face appeared next, her voice remarkably steady as she looked directly into the camera and confirmed that her older sister had saved her life. Maya Chen stepped into the room, her production headset blinking with a small red light. The producer gave me a quiet nod, signaling that the preliminary segment was wrapping up. I stood up, walked out of the heavy wooden doors, and stepped onto the manicured grass of the $40 million estate. A string quartet began to play, the notes drifting out over the crashing ocean waves. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Connor, waiting at the end of the aisle, choosing not to ask a single question about the security perimeter. I did not know my parents had left their luxury resort the second they saw Hallie on screen. I would not see the high-definition footage from the press staging area until the following morning. But the external perimeter cameras captured every single desperate second of their arrival. While I took my first steps down the white fabric runner, a black town car pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates. Martin marched straight toward the security detail, adjusting his expensive tie, operating on the lifelong assumption that his mere presence commanded total compliance. Gloria walked right beside him, her posture rigid with indignation. My mother stepped up to the metal bars and announced to the guards that they were the parents of the bride. The head of private security did not flinch, and he did not mock them. He checked his clipboard, looked back up, and asked the exact question we had prepared. "Do you have an invitation?" Gloria opened her designer clutch. She reached inside and pulled out the jagged, torn pieces of the heavy cream paper. They were the very fragments she had kept in her purse for 5 months, intending to use them as physical proof that I was creating unnecessary drama. She tried to hand them to the guard, demanding immediate entry. The heavy metal gates remained firmly locked. Frustration immediately boiled over into public outrage. Martin pivoted away from the gate and turned toward the bank of flashing press cameras, attempting to hijack the narrative in real time. The former consultant declared that I was a dangerous individual and that my younger sister was currently being exploited by a malicious media campaign. His practiced corporate mask held for exactly 30 seconds. Then, a seasoned reporter stepped forward, holding a printed copy of the Whitmore Development Strategies invoice. The journalist asked my father to explain the performance bonuses tied directly to my continued confinement at Hawthorne Ridge. The camera caught the exact moment my father realized he could no longer control the room. His face flushed a dark, violent red. The man who prided himself on absolute composure lost complete control, pointing a shaking finger directly at the camera lens. "She was destroying everything," he yelled, his voice cracking over the coastal wind. Sending her away was the only way to stop her. He had just publicly admitted that my institutionalization was about maintaining his authority, not about medical necessity. Another reporter immediately seized the opening, turning to Gloria to ask about the intercepted mail. My mother fell back on her favorite lifelong defense, claiming she was strictly forbidden by the doctors from visiting the treatment wing. The journalist did not miss a beat. He read the exact line from the administrative log where she had personally signed the communication restriction. The panic in Gloria's eyes was absolute and entirely transparent. The woman who prized family loyalty above all else instantly turned on her husband, blaming Martin for the financial arrangement before spinning back to the cameras to loudly insist I had always been a master manipulator. Their unified front shattered into a million irreversible pieces on live television. Inside the estate grounds, the air smelled heavily of jasmine and sea salt. I reached the end of the aisle, sliding my hand into Connor's. Maya stood off to the side, tapping her earpiece with a frantic finger. The producer leaned in close, whispering to ask if I wanted her to pull up the live gate feed on a production tablet so I could watch them unravel. I shook my head, my answer an absolute no. Hallie sat in the very first row, twisting the expensive fabric of her dress between her fingers. My sister leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper over the ocean breeze, and asked if I didn't want to watch them lose everything they had built. I looked back at Connor, feeling the solid, grounding warmth of his hand holding mine. "I watched them take enough," I told her, my voice carrying no anger, only a profound and overwhelming relief. Today I wanted to see what I kept. We exchanged our vows under the floral arch, the broadcast concluding with a celebration of reclaimed agency rather than a bitter family execution. The sun was already rising over the Pacific the next morning when my phone vibrated on the hotel nightstand. Elena Ruiz was calling to deliver the overnight fallout. 3 separate corporate boards had already demanded Martin's immediate resignation, and a massive group of former Hawthorne Ridge residents was actively organizing to join a consolidated civil suit. I let out a long breath, finally hanging up the phone, only to see a single text message illuminate the glass screen. It was from Gloria. The message contained no apology, no reflection, and absolutely no surrender. It simply read, "Look what you made us lose." The viral footage of my father losing his mind at the estate gates played on a silent loop on the corner television of our local coffee shop exactly 1 week later. I watched his face turn that familiar, dangerous shade of crimson on the small screen, took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, and turned my attention back to the architectural blueprints Connor had spread across the scratched wooden table. We had spent 3 quiet days entirely disconnected from the digital fallout, completely avoiding the frantic news cycle before returning to our normal morning routines. Several entertainment producers had flooded my voicemail with lucrative interview offers, begging for an exclusive sit-down to dissect the family drama. I deleted every single request. Building a brand new life off a public spectacle was exactly what my parents would have done, and I refused to follow their blueprint. The corporate wreckage accumulated rapidly over the next 3 months, tearing through my father's carefully constructed empire. 3 separate executive boards demanded Martin's immediate resignation before October even finished, terrified that the growing public backlash would poison their own profit margins. Elena issued sweeping legal preservation notices to his former insurance providers, formally warning the corporate underwriters that the recovered administrative logs strongly indicated extensive financial misreporting. My mother found herself completely isolated in the affluent suburban community she had spent decades carefully cultivating. The local charity board quietly asked Gloria to step down from her prestigious chairmanship, citing the negative press. The women she used to host for Sunday brunch abruptly stopped returning her phone calls, unable to look past the televised image of her signature on that facility communication restriction form. Hallie changed her phone number and enforced a strict period of zero contact. My younger sister packed her bags and moved into a small, outdated apartment on the opposite side of the city, leaving our parents alone in their massive, empty house. Early in 2026, the threat of an expansive forensic discovery phase finally cracked my father's stubborn resolve. The corporate insurance underwriters recognized the massive liability of his fraudulent consulting contracts and demanded an emergency out-of-court mediation. They desperately wanted to avoid handing those financial documents over to state regulatory agencies. By May, the legal teams hammered out a massive civil settlement agreement. Martin and the insurance companies agreed to fund a substantial compensation trust for the facility survivors without officially admitting to criminal charges. The heavy financial penalty forced my parents to quietly liquidate their extensive investment portfolio and list the sprawling family home for sale. Meanwhile, the state licensing board permanently revoked Leonard Pike's operational certification, ensuring the former director could never run a youth care facility again. Hallie and I did not magically become best friends overnight, despite the dramatic resolution. We started seeing a family specialist every other Tuesday, sitting in a neutral therapy office that smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. We slowly learned how to occupy the same room without falling back into our assigned childhood roles. My younger sister worked long, exhausting hours at a mid-level marketing firm just to cover her own rent, learning to navigate the world without the safety net of our parents' bank accounts or her former fiancé's influence. I paid for my half of our therapy sessions, but I never once wrote her a check to ease her transition. We needed to build a relationship based on mutual respect, and throwing money at the problem would only repeat the cycle of control. A thick cream envelope arrived at my law office in late May. I recognized the sweeping cursive immediately, and a faint trace of my mother's expensive floral perfume still clung to the paper. Gloria begged for a single phone call, spending 3 entire pages detailing exactly how much she missed her daughters. However, she dedicated the remaining paragraphs to complaining bitterly about losing the house and blaming my stubbornness for tearing the family apart. The woman still could not ask a single question about how I was actually doing. I did not waste my breath or my energy on a reply. I simply handed the letter to Elena, who promptly mailed back a formal notice demanding all future correspondence route exclusively through her legal firm. June arrived with a warm, steady coastal breeze. I stood inside the climate-controlled archive room of the new Survivor Support Foundation, holding the small velvet box containing my original hospital bracelet. The faded plastic band had defined my existence for 22 years, acting as a constant, heavy reminder of the false narrative my parents had forced upon me. They had spent over 2 decades deciding exactly who I was, but the final decision belonged entirely to me. I placed the box onto a cold metal shelving unit, resting it right next to the digitized copies of the unedited videotape. I did not keep the illusion of a perfect family. Instead, I kept my own name, my marriage, my career, and the absolute right to choose exactly who crossed the threshold into my life. I closed the heavy archive door, the electronic lock clicking solidly into place. A junior foundation coordinator met me in the hallway, carrying a fresh stack of manila intake folders. The young woman stopped, gesturing quietly toward the front reception area. She told me a 16-year-old girl had just walked into the lobby, trembling and looking for legal help because her parents had just threatened to send her to a residential behavioral center. I turned my head, looking down the long corridor toward the frosted glass doors of the waiting room. The personal revenge crusade was officially over. But the actual work was just beginning. I adjusted the strap of my leather briefcase, took a deep breath, and walked out to meet her. When the people who are supposed to protect you turn your own life into a business, you learn that silence is never a safe compromise. True strength is not about orchestrating a grand retaliation to prove your worth to those who refuse to see it. It is about setting firm boundaries, refusing to let someone else control your narrative, and protecting your peace. Justice is rarely about making your enemies suffer. It is about calling the truth by its right name and stopping the cycle before it destroys someone else. Ask yourself this: when the people you love demand your silence as the price of belonging, how far would you go to protect your own voice?